So this is not the video I had originally planned to release, but I was recently inundated with a lot of interest around a particular topic. That is, the relationship between UFOs and missing persons cases. I think this interest is almost entirely due to the release of a trailer for the movie Missing 411: The UFO Connection. Because I've seen such interest in the topic, I thought it would be prudent to cover it in this video. The idea that certain missing persons cases have UFO involvement has been around for a while. In some cases where individuals disappear entirely, it can be an easy explanation to say that a UFO abducted them. As I've stated previously on this channel, my priority is always to find the most rational or worldly explanation for any given case, if it presents itself. If a case lacks a more conventional explanation, then I am always open to the more paranormal explanations. As far as paranormal explanations go, I would place UFO abduction at the top of the list, mainly because there is some convincing evidence not only for the existence of UFOs, but also some compelling testimony from abductees. Without seeing the new Missing 411 movie, I obviously can't comment on the accuracy of any of the information. If you have seen this channel's coverage of cases that were featured in previous movies, then you likely have some inclination of my opinion of Missing 411 in general. Still, the topic is certainly worth investigation because UFO abduction, if it indeed exists, can easily be tied into missing persons. Abduction in general can be considered an explanation for many unsolved missing persons cases. Now, watching the trailer for the new Missing 411 movie, I recognized some cases that appear to be highlighted in the movie. 2 missing persons cases and 2 UFO abduction incidents were prominently shown. The details of each of these incidents reveal a kind of theme that this movie presumably will be about, as they share details like the location of incidents or the abduction of wild animals by UFOs. The first missing persons case is Charles Dwayne Gustafson, a hunter who disappeared in the Medicine Bow National Forest. The second, Mark Anthony Strittmater, was also a hunter, and he also disappeared in the Medicine Bow National Forest. UFO-related incidents include an abduction of wild elk in Washington in 1999 and a UFO abductee who was the center point of the trailer by the name of Carl Higdon. Mr. Higdon claims to have been abducted by aliens while hunting in none other than the Medicine Bow National Forest. Mr. Higdon's story is nothing if not interesting, so let's go over exactly what he says happened to him in 1974. At the time, Carl Higdon was 40 years old and a veteran oil driller. On October 25th, he left home to pick up his crew so that they could go to work, only to find that all of them were sick that day. Carl decided to take the day off and spend it elk hunting instead. Carl grabbed a rifle from his home and began driving to McCarty Canyon. On the way, he encountered some hunters whose truck had broke down on the roadside. The hunters suggested that Carl try hunting in the Medicine Bow National Forest, and this is what he decided to do. Carl eventually parked his truck and ran into a local game warden with whom he chatted very briefly. He then wandered off into the forest before coming to a clearing where he saw 5 elk. He then took his rifle and aimed at one of the bulls before firing, but there was no sound of a gunshot when he fired. The 7mm Magnum round that came out of his rifle moved slowly through the air before dropping to the ground, as if gravity itself was being affected by some unknown force. Carl picked up the spent rifle shell and put it in his pocket. Then he suddenly became aware of a man approaching him from behind. But this was no normal human being. Carl described him as being around 6 feet tall, with straw-like hair that stood straight up, as well as 2 long strands that appeared to be antennas. The being had no noticeable chin, with a yellowish skin tone, and small eyes with no eyebrows. He was dressed in a black suit reminiscent of a wetsuit, and had bowed legs. He also wore a wide belt with a 6-pointed star emblem on it. Carl was unable to see if the being had any hands, and instead noticed that there were 2 tapered rod-like appendages. It appeared to Carl that the being could control the force of gravity with these rod-like hands. The being asked Carl if he was hungry, and Carl replied that he was. The being then floated a pack of pills over to Carl and told him to take one. With the feeling that all of his willpower had suddenly been removed, Carl did as he was told and took the pill. The being then asked Carl if he would like to go with them, and Carl said that he would. Carl is very suddenly transported into a clear, cube-like object that he noticed on the ground not far from the alien being. He is then strapped to a chair and he notices the 5 elk are in there with him, though they are motionless, almost like they've been sedated. Carl can see his pickup truck on the ground through the clear walls of the cube ship, and he realizes that it has been rising into the air. 2 additional beings placed a helmet on Carl's head that had wires sticking out of it. One of them waves a hand and everything disappears, and all Carl can see is a blue ball. Then, a blinding bright light. He begins to see a tower that reminds him of the Seattle Space Needle. Below it are what appear to be humans. 2 aliens then begin taking Carl down a long hallway. They do not walk though, they float. Inside a large room, the aliens give Carl some form of examination, and eventually tell him that he is not what they want, and they will be returning him to where he came from. Carl is once again bathed in a blindingly bright light. Carl is then introduced to a being named Fxllxng, who informs him that he will be taking him back home. Fxllxng tells Carl how they have been coming to Earth for many years in order to take fish and wild game. They use the Earth animals to make their food, which is in pill form. Fxllxng also mentions that all the oceans on the alien planet are yellow, and all the fish have died. The alien also explains that they are 163,000 light years away from Earth, that he is also a hunter, and that his people wear black suits to protect them from the Earth's sun. The next thing Carl knows, he is hovering over a forest, and he is floating down towards the ground outside of the alien craft. Carl falls to the ground in pain. He sees a sign that says North Boundary Lincoln Forest. Carl doesn't know where he is, but begins walking as darkness is quickly approaching. He soon stumbles upon his pickup truck where he climbs inside and just sits. Carl hears someone speaking through the 2-way radio in his car, but he can't remember how to work it. In fact, he can't even remember how to drive. Carl eventually figures the radio out enough to get a hold of someone. He begins rambling to the man about how he doesn't know where he is or what he's doing, about the strange men in black suits, and about being incredibly cold. Around this time, Carl's boss calls his wife Marjorie to tell her that they are talking to a man on the company radio who they believe to be Carl, but he is not making any sense. The local sheriff was contacted, and using information gathered from the game warden who had spoke to Carl earlier in the day, they were able to pick a search location. Searchers on the ground noticed the sky was unusually bright for nighttime, almost like the sun was rising. Marjorie and other searchers found Carl's pickup that same night, and came across Carl in a rather frantic state, still rambling about the people who took his elk. The truck was found stuck in a muck hole with no noticeable tracks leading to it. They decide to take Carl to Carbon County Memorial Hospital. Once there, they notice Carl's eyes are watering profusely, his shoulder is hurting, and he is talking about floating pills. Carl talks to the doctor on call about his 163,000 light-year journey. The doctor subsequently orders Carl to be drug tested. The lights in the room have to be turned off because Carl's eyes are so sensitive. The doctor eventually determined that Carl had no broken bones and tested negative for drugs. Carl's wife reports that the diagnosis was amnesic shock. Doctors keep Carl for observation as he still cannot remember his name or recognize his wife. Marjorie gave Carl a pencil and paper to write down all he could remember, and Carl ended up drawing a picture of the being he saw, and also the words Ender and Saltillo Street. Marjorie would go home and later find the shell casing fired from Carl's rifle. It was in a mangled state. She later showed the item to the local sheriff, who said it appeared to be a shell casing turned inside out. Carl's memory returned when his daughter visited him in the hospital. Carl would go on to tell his story to newspapers and psychologists. One of these men, Dr. R. Leo Sprinkle, put Carl into a state of hypnosis in order to have him remember his ordeal. Sprinkle indicated that he believed Carl was being genuine in the telling of his story. Later on, Carl would attribute some beneficial health effects to the incident. He no longer got kidney stones and no longer had scarring on his lungs that was previously there. The spent shell casing then disappeared from a safe at the University of Wyoming. Carl Higdon's story is without a doubt bizarre, but like many stories of UFO abduction, it is difficult to verify. There were many witnesses to the events both preceding and after the abduction, which certainly adds credibility. The incident was well publicized shortly after, and Carl's wife would go on to write a book about the event. On the skeptical side of things, the description of the alien itself is rather bizarre, but perhaps that is simply to be expected of a being from another world. It's interesting, though, that in some ways the description resembles that of an Andorian from Star Trek, which began airing in 1966. Some other details also feel questionable, like the fact that Carl claims he was inside a 7-foot by 7-foot cubicle with 2 aliens and 5 adult elk. The logistics of that don't make much sense, but then again we are talking about beings who can control gravity, so who knows what's possible. Perhaps Carl's visual measurement of the space was simply off. The idea that alien beings traveled over 100,000 light-years in order to capture a handful of elk to feed their planet is also hard to grasp. Would a people who are so technologically advanced really be so desperate for food that they are forced to hunt for it on Earth and so far away? It's also interesting to note that Carl admitted that he had previously told his wife that if he ever encountered alien beings from another world, he would talk with them or go with them. That is a pretty unusual thing to say or even be thinking about, and puts his claims under even greater scrutiny. Ultimately, the story is whatever you want to make of it. Now, I assume that this incident will perhaps be used in the new Missing 411 movie to connect to or explain other disappearances that have occurred in the Medicine Bow National Forest, and also the abduction of wild game by UFOs. First, let's cover the Medicine Bow National Forest cases, Charles Gustafson and Mark Strittmater. So what do we know about these two cases? Well, first I can tell you that the Carbon County Sheriff Archie Roybal is pretty tight-fisted with his case files for both, as I contacted his office for the release of both case files and was denied. I attempted to appeal the decision directly to Sheriff Roybal himself, but was once again rejected. Before anyone thinks that's strange though, I just want to say that I run into that pretty often. Both cases are currently unsolved with no body having been found. Law enforcement doesn't like it when they don't have a body. The case can appear as straightforward as anything, but if they haven't found at least one bone, some sheriffs are hesitant to release anything. So here is what is currently public about both cases. 72-year-old Charles Gustafson went to the Medicine Bow National Forest on a hunting trip with his cousin and nephew in October 10th of 2006. The group was said to have made camp about 8 miles south of Arlington. The first day of their hunt, the three fanned out in different directions. Charles ended up getting lost on this day, but luckily, he ran into a logger who was able to help get him back to his camp. The others in his group would later tell the sheriff that it seemed Charles was having orientation problems, possibly due to the altitude. Despite this rather troubling development, the group went hunting the next day as well. Again, they all fanned out in different directions, and once again, Charles must have become lost. He never returned back to camp. One of Charles's relatives said that they fired 3 shots in the air, and said they heard 3 shots fired in response, presumably by Charles. After that, there was no further sign of him. The Carbon Creek Sheriff was notified, and they had searchers in the area on foot, horseback, and ATVs. Night temperatures at the time were in the 30s, and a snowstorm hit the area the following week, which grounded search helicopters. Quite a few inches of snow was dropped on the ground during this time. Charles had been in the Air Force when he was young, and had even been an instructor in survival training. But his age and possible mental decline, whether it be from altitude or something else, likely played a large role in his disappearance. To this day, Charles has still not been found. 44-year-old Mark Anthony Strittmater was heading into the Medicine Bow National Forest to go hunting on October 19th of 2019. He was last seen on surveillance cameras at the Come and Go in Saratoga, Wyoming around 5:45 a.m. At 11 a.m., he sent a text message to his girlfriend. This was the last time anyone had any contact with Mark, and he was reported missing the next day. His truck was later found on Forest Road 801. The weather in the area was especially bad while Mark was lost, with temperatures reportedly going below zero, along with snowstorms. The initial search for Mark included people on foot, canines, and aerial drones, but nothing of value was found. The following year, a hunter found a pair of binoculars about 600 yards from where the truck had been parked. Authorities searched the area and turned up some other small items believed to be Mark's, but he remains missing to this day. Viewed collectively, can we draw any sort of conclusion from these incidents? Could what happened to Carl Higdon also have happened to Gustafson and Strittmater? I would be very skeptical, if for no other reason than because we know very little about both of these missing persons cases, and the sheriff at this time is unwilling to say what they know. These cases also don't necessarily jive with the Higdon incident, where the claim is that the aliens came down to take wild game back to their planet for food. Because of this, I'm not sure we can say there's anything especially strange going on in Medicine Bow. The next thing I want to mention is the Elk Abduction Incident referenced in the trailer that reportedly occurred in Washington in 1999. Information on this incident is difficult to find, and I could not track down any original newspaper clippings of the incident aside from a column written by a man in 1999 who simply relays the story that was posted online. The incident seems to have been solely reported to UFO investigators. In some instances, I've read the men involved were loggers. In others, they were state forestry workers planting trees. Either way, the incident goes something like this. On February 25, 1999, 3 men in the Mount St. Helens area noticed a disc-shaped object come into their field of view, moving very purposefully and silent as it flew through the air. The workers called to the rest of their crew, possibly more than 11 men, and the group watched a bizarre scene play out. The UFO flew over to a herd of elk that were grazing nearby, and began hovering over them. The elk began to get agitated, and soon one of them became separated from the rest. The UFO zeroed in on this lone elk and began lifting it into the air using some sort of invisible tractor beam. The UFO began to ascend as the elk started moving closer and closer to the disc itself. The object then began to head off towards the east at a high rate of speed, presumably taking the elk up inside it. On March 1st, the incident was reported to the National UFO Reporting Center, who then contacted MUFON to lead the investigation. MUFON spoke to the 3 main witnesses and went to the location itself. The corpse of an elk was reportedly found on the roadside a few miles away from the abduction site. While nobody could say whether this was the same elk, they were shocked to discover that it had no obvious signs of injury, and for 8 days no other predatory animals had touched it. I could see where someone would look at the Higdon incident and the elk abduction in 1999 and make a connection, but I believe the 2 incidents are actually less similar than people may think. Sure, they both involve taking of elk by a UFO, but consider the purpose. In the Higdon incident, Carl said the aliens took 5 elk because they wanted to use them for food. In the Washington incident, which occurred 25 years later, the UFO took a single elk from an entire group. The MUFON investigators believe that same elk was dropped back down onto the earth, dead. Had this UFO wanted to use the elk for food purposes, you would think it would have taken all of them, much less take one and return it dead. Incidents of UFOs taking or mutilating animals have been reported for a long time, and I could go on forever about the numerous theories I've heard regarding why these animals would be taken. The simple truth is, we don't know. Not a very satisfying conclusion, I admit, but it is the fact of the matter. Perhaps the new Missing 411 movie will have some interesting interviews with eyewitnesses or families surrounding these events. Overall, I think the topic in general is thought-provoking and worthy of discussion. Let me know what you think of this UFO connection in the comments. And until next time, thanks for watching.